You know that moment when you realize that your corporate change program is being described by a professional euphemism generator? I mean, corporate jargon, I hate it. It's like the color drains from the sky, your soul is leached from your body, and most importantly, the purpose and the life of your change program is crushed. Margaret Heffernan is a former tech CEO, a brilliant author, and a professional truth teller. In this episode, we are going to dig into why sanitized language is making everything worse, how treating your team and your employees as actual adults might change everything, and the story of how Pixar threw out the corporate handbook and in doing so saved millions. If ever there's a guest who's good at cutting through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works, it might just be Margaret Heffernan. This is going to be fun. Cut through the blather, the BS, and the noise. Find the good stuff that works in change management. I'm Michael Bungay-Stanier, and this is Change Signal. If you lead change, one way to think about your role is that you are actively guiding people from the present into the future. You're accelerating that shift, which is exactly why it's so hard. People don't want to leave the present because we all live with the comfortable illusion that we understand it and that we control it. The future, on the other hand?
I came across this nerdy data point about the degree to which we can't accurately predict the future over any significant period of time. And so I set out to pose the question, well, if we can't see the future, what do we do? We can't just stand there paralyzed. What do we do to try to get glimpses of it or to prepare ourselves or to be more likely to spot it as it begins to emerge?
Margaret Heffernan is the author of Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future. So when I'm thinking about how to bring myself and others into the future, a place that is inherently unknown and unpredictable and ambiguous and, just as she says, uncharted, well, Margaret is one of my great teachers. She's a business professor, she's been a CEO in the tech space, and she now mentors chief executives of large global businesses. In other words, she has wrestled long and hard with the practice of transformation. Margaret, welcome.
Oh, it's really nice to be talking to you again, Michael.
If I take your experience and your wisdom and I ask you to be in front of an audience of people who lead change in organizations, which are the people who listen to this podcast, and say, so Margaret, building on your experience as a mentor, as an executive, as a writer, as a speaker, what is your main idea about change that you'd want these people to know?
Well, I think I'm going to steal it from James Lovelock, not because I don't think I had thought this before, but I think he encapsulated it better than I've heard anybody ever do. So I went to a talk he gave years ago talking about his career. And a very critical moment in his career as an independent scientist, which is a very, very rare being.
That's right.
Is he was approached by NASA and asked, could he think of a way or a device by which to test whether there was life on Mars? And he came up with an absolutely brilliant answer. He said, I think I can invent a gadget, which if you can drop it into or bring it to the atmosphere of Mars, can detect if there's any change in the atmosphere. And if there is no change, there is no life.
No change, no life. No change, no life. You know, I do wonder if this is some consolation, perhaps, to those of us who feel that change is continuous and relentless and unforgiving. Well, it's also a confirmation that we're alive. Do you remember when change suddenly became something that you tuned into as an important thing? Was there a moment?
Well, it's interesting. I think I became most focused on it, I suppose, when I was writing, or maybe even after I'd written Willful Blindness. And I went around the world talking about it. And I realized that there was an aspect to willful blindness I hadn't considered, which was not just the things that are going wrong in a company at any or an organization at any given moment, which is what the bulk of the first edition of Willful Blindness focused on, but the failure to see something coming and to adapt to it. And in that context, I drew on my own experience. For example, when I was running tech companies, and I was running a business which was really one of the earliest streaming media businesses.
Right.
And I had a meeting with Disney, who were absolutely blunt, if not definitely aggressive, in saying to me that over their dead bodies, would they ever entrust their precious legacy of masterpieces to heathens in the technology world like myself.
Right.
So that really got me thinking that the flip side of willful blindness is not just not seeing what's in front of you today, but not being able to think about what might be coming.
Knowing that the typical experience of trying to introduce change in organizations is resistance to change in organization because homeostasis, the system often resists the push. How would you mentor or coach them, or perhaps even the senior executives and CEOs that you work with, to shift that perspective on change?
Well, I would certainly encourage them to reframe it as life moving forward, an adventure.
Yeah.
Rather than, these are the jobs we're going to eliminate. These are the costs we're going to eliminate.
Right.
I would certainly encourage them to be blunt and not use a lot of euphemisms around it. And it would be very, very clear about why the change is necessary. I can remember once seeing a request for proposals that came from a large UK business. And it was for a transformation program, right? Because we used to have change programs. Now they're transformation programs. I don't know what they're going to be, that's even grander than that.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But anyway, I read it and I thought, okay, this is not a change program. This is a cost-cutting program.
Right.
If you're doing a cost-cutting program, call it that. Let's not pussyfoot around. You fool nobody.
Right.
And you just make people incredibly cynical about really what's going on. So I think it's important to use language clearly and honestly. And if cost reduction is part of it, fess up, say so.
Right.
Be honest about what the upsides are for whom. And
why is that euphemistic language so common, so seductive?
Well, it's seductive because often, and I would hope this would be the case, very few business leaders get positive delight out of firing great swathes of their workforce, right?
Right.
I mean, they'd have to be kind of psychopathic if they did. So they feel uncomfortable about it. And so they kind of try to pretend that it's not really happening.
Right.
But of course it is happening. And of course everybody can see that it's happening. So it's much better to just be straightforward and say, what are the conditions which require us to do things differently? It's also important to be able to say that. To have thought seriously about what the intent of the program is.
Right.
Like, are you really doing it to make your business more adaptive and more creative or more inclusive or whatever it may be?
Yeah.
Or actually, are you just slashing costs so you can pay dividends?
Right.
I mean, let's be very, very clear about this. And if it's the latter, please just say so. Because if you treat people like grown-ups, they are very, very much more likely to respond as grown-ups.
Got it.
And if you treat them like children who can't understand the truth, then they're going to start responding like children. So you're better off to just call it as it is and move on from there.
I've got a lot of thoughts as I listen to Margaret. This is probably TMI as to how my brain works, but I first go to Monty Python, the British comedy troupe. And if you don't know their Dead Parrot sketch, if you want some humor about being euphemistic about change, well, this is about as good as it gets. But more seriously, when Margaret says you need to treat them like grown-ups, not children, it really speaks to the way organizations, I think, inherently infantilize us. It's driven by the need for structure, the need for control. Let me tell you what to do. Let me tell you how to behave. And so let me be provocative with you for a moment as a change leader. How might you be treating your audience for change as children? How might you be treating your sponsors and the senior executives the same way? In fact, how might you be treating your change team like that? So, the challenge if you're a change leader is that you're fully entangled in the world of agendas and hierarchy and power and structure. And how would you guide somebody in that world to encourage those that lead change to perhaps be more courageous and more clear about what's actually happening?
Yeah.
How do you navigate the politics?
I would say that in most companies, there's a huge amount of effort and energy that goes into talking about what's happening in the business. There's often very little discussion about what's happening outside in the world.
Yeah.
And it's so I think it's very crucial to embed the narrative around change in a bigger narrative around the world. Because typically many change programs are a process of adaptation. And we all adapt to the way the world changes. You know, you and I were not doing this kind of conversation online 5 years ago. We've all adapted. That's what people do. That's what companies do. It's why the human race has been so very successful.
Right.
So I think you have to provide the context, which many business leaders forget to do. That doesn't mean it's a scapegoat, but it does give people a broader sense of the environment in which change is occurring.
Right.
I think the other thing is if you run a business that has something real and meaningful to offer to the world, then it's in the nature of life that as the world changes, it will have to change too. So there isn't any way of freezing a company to make it permanent. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I see people making is to assume that when this change program or this transformation program is over, well, then we're done. Then it'll be okay. Then you can sit down and heave a sigh of relief and everything will be frozen in aspect.
Yeah.
Change is a constant.
Change is life.
Change is life. Exactly.
Change at an organizational level often fails.
Margaret, one of the themes that I pick up from Uncharted, and I'd love your wisdom on, is, how to say it? How do you invite and enable agency in an organization so people maintain the capacity and the courage to try things, to keep changing, to not just go, my job is to be changed, but to actually be an active participant in the way that an organization is shifting and changing? It's a really tricky topic, I think, but I'm curious to know if you have a perspective on what it takes to invite agency.
I'm very interested in people who have agency and people who don't. And I'm interested in why and how. And the people I've worked with in much of my life who absolutely do are artists.
Right.
They make things that nobody asked for. They start before they have an invitation or a contract or any hope of success. They persevere often for decades through failure and being ignored. And yet they keep going and they keep going. And then they change. And usually when they're very successful, then they change, right?
Right.
So if they started out as acoustic musicians, they become electric, and vice versa.
Right.
If they're realist painters, then they become abstract, all sorts of things. The minute they've found that magic landing place where everybody loves them, they jump out of it. So it's made me think a lot about why do we have organizations that are so full of people who don't have these qualities?
Right.
And when I talk to CEOs and business leaders, they're all right now complaining. My people don't have creative thinking. They don't take the initiative. They're not creative problem solvers. And I think there are two reasons, or two major reasons. The first is that certainly in the US and the UK, which are the places I know best, the arts have been really methodically stripped out of the education system.
True. Yes.
To a degree that was alarming even to me when I started putting numbers around it. That has produced several generations now of what I describe as expert second guessers.
Right.
They are fantastic at passing exams. They're fantastic at guessing the answer that you have in your head. They are absolutely paralyzed if you say, I don't want my answer, I want yours. At the same time, that's what the bulk of management thinking has endorsed also.
Right.
So we have come up with this extraordinarily now elaborate rigmarole of job definitions, job descriptions, KPIs, targets, goals, measurements, incentives, rewards.
Yes.
To the point that we are managing people like robots. And so we cannot be surprised when they start to behave like robots. So we have come up with a management regime, performance management regime, that conditions people to behave in a way that is deeply obedient, deeply conformist, and effectively strips them of agency. And I would say in the companies I work with nowadays, that's the biggest problem they have. And many of them come to me and say, how can I make my people more creative? How can I make them more curious so they have more agency?
Yes.
And I'll say, well, do you have all these job descriptions, key KPIs, targets, rewards, all this stuff? And they nod enthusiastically. And I say, well, then I can't help you.
Right.
If you're not prepared to get rid of this mumbo jumbo and give people agency, then you cannot expect them to take it.
Yeah. When I first asked that question about agency to Margaret, honestly, I wasn't expecting us to have a conversation about funding arts education. Although, to be clear, I am fully there for that. As someone with a couple of English degrees, married to someone who has even more English literature degrees. Margaret's metaphor of robots actually reminds me of the very first Change Signal interview we did with Pim de Moray. Now, his organization is called Corporate Rebels. And rebels feels about as opposite to robots as it's possible to be. As a change leader, I am wondering what language you use to describe your work. Are you closer to robot? Are you closer to rebel? Is there some other word that captures the spirit in which you want to do your work? So if I'm in an organization, at this stage, do I just put my head down on the table and weep quietly to myself because I'm like, what can I do? I've got a bunch of people who sit in the status quo, are satisfied with the status quo, aren't likely to shift the status quo. And I'm trying to make change happen. And part of my commitment to making change happen is not to do change to people, but to engage them in the change process so they have some agency.
Yeah.
Is there any hope for me? Is there anything I can do? Or do I just have to work with something that feels very broken?
Well, I think there's definitely hope for you. And I think if if the business leader you're hypothesizing has already decided that they want to engage people in the process, then you're already a step ahead of the game.
Right.
One of the best stories about this kind of thing that I've ever come across is the story that John Lasseter tells in his book, Creativity, Inc.
About Pixar, a fantastic book.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. And it covers a period in Pixar's history when it was clear that after a huge string of incredibly successful, fabulous films, their movies were getting more and more expensive because they were taking longer and longer. And he was concerned about this for two reasons. One is that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
But the other thing he was afraid of was if they get more and more expensive, people become more and more risk averse.
Right.
And we made our name taking risks. So this could be an existential danger to us if we keep getting more and more expensive and slow.
Mm-hmm.
So his first thought was to do what most people want to do, which is grab the org charts, grab the Excel spreadsheets, go to a swanky hotel for a couple of days with your senior leadership team, move all the numbers and face cards around, and then come down and just kind of pray it works.
Yeah.
And at the last minute, he decided, no, actually, let's just ask everybody. Why don't, just explain, here's the problem. We want to hear every single answer you think might be relevant.
Yeah.
They carved those into subject areas. They shut the business for a day and turned everybody over to a World Cafe environment.
Yeah.
Where everybody could go for an hour at each table, about culture, HR, engineering, tools, you name it, all the different aspects of the job.
And just to interrupt for a moment, the World Cafe setup, for people who don't know that, is a kind of facilitative process by which people get a chance to sit down, move around, share their opinions. It's a way of kind of collecting the input from a system in a very kind of human, flexible way. And actually interrupting again, because I want to recommend a couple of resources if the World Cafe is a new concept for you. The first resource is a 1999 book called The Change Handbook. It's edited by Peggy Homan and Tom Devane, and it captures a really wide range and summarizes a wide range of group methods for facilitation, like the World Cafe. And the second book is a 2013 book called The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures. And this is all about teaching, sharing, kind of small, powerful, facilitative interactions that can really help shift cultures.
And the acid test at the end of each hour, before you moved on to another topic table, was who's prepared to champion which ideas. Because if nobody's going to champion them, then they're not going to work.
Yeah.
So it was a great editing question.
Yeah.
So they took at the end of the day, they took all the ideas that people were prepared to champion them, and they introduced them into the system.
Right.
Now, some of them were really weird. They're the ones I remember and like most. So one of the things people said was, we've grown very fast. Most people don't know very many people.
Right.
We all work too hard to socialize, which is an endemic problem in American businesses. So we need somehow to get to know each other. So they came up with the idea of blind date lunches.
Oh, nice.
So once a week, you're just going to have lunch with somebody you don't know in the company. Well, after a year of that, you can solve problems so much faster. Because either you know exactly who to go to, or you know roughly who to go to, who will know exactly who to go to.
Exactly. Yeah.
The consequence of this was Lasseter's goal was to cut the cost of the films by 10%.
Yeah.
And they cut them by 20%.
That's so good.
Now, when you adopt a process like that, you don't need to sell the program to people because they designed it.
Right.
So this whole uphill battle and cheerleading stuff that goes on with, don't worry, it's going to be great, it's going to be fun. You get rid of all that nonsense.
Yeah.
Because people feel really committed to the stuff that they invented themselves.
Yeah. One of the things that bugs me about change management, really part of the reason I started this series and launching this new brand, is just how much terrible advice there is out in the world around how change works.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if there's one or two pieces of change wisdom, and I'm using air quotes around that, that drives you nuts, that you're like, I just wish that would die because it is just wrong and it's just unsustainable.
I think the worst is the cheerleading. It'll be a journey and it'll be fun.
Right.
Now, the journey thing just annoys me because it's trite.
Right.
The it'll be fun annoys me because everybody knows it isn't true.
Right.
And what happens, if you say it'll be fun, then when you hit that moment in the program, when it's just bloody hard,
that inevitable moment, yeah,
everybody thinks, well, you obviously didn't know what you were talking about.
Right.
And now we're following this leader who doesn't know what he's doing.
Right.
So they either become cynical or they become extremely hopeless. If instead you say, look, we're changing a lot. I know it's going to be really difficult. I know for sure, from my own experience, there are going to be days we will wish we had never started this,
Right.
and where we don't know how to get out of it. But it's okay, because if we stick together, we will get through it, and it will be better at the other end. But, rest up, look after yourselves, because this is going to be a tough slog.
Right.
Then when you hit that quagmire, everybody thinks, oh, right, we're on track, right? This is what he said it was going to be, or this is what she said it was going to be. She warned us about this. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. It just goes with the territory.
Margaret, for people who want more of you and your work and your thinking, where do they find you in the world?
Well, the best place to find me, so for a semblance of me, is on my website, which is just www.mheffernan.com. And of course, my TED Talks, as you know, are on the TED website.
Brilliant. Thank you. Before you go, there was a moment when Margaret was reflecting about people's orientation to change that we didn't find a way of including in the main interview, but I want you to hear now.
I guess I was more likely to think of it as an adventure than as a loss.
Yeah.
And I think that when it comes to change, people kind of fall into somewhere along that spectrum. They may think about it as an adventure and loss, which I think is perfectly realistic. But in general, I think people tend towards one end or the other of the spectrum.
Adventure or loss? Adventure or loss? So notice your bias. Which one do you tend towards? Because on your team and in your audience, the people you're inviting to change, and with your sponsors, there will be some who have the same orientation that you do, and there will be some that don't. And it's helpful to know how your preference might blind you to the needs of others, and therefore blind you to the tools you might use and the approaches you might take. If you know other leaders of change, like you, who are perhaps up for the adventure, would you tell them about this podcast or this episode, please? Change Signal grows best by word of mouth, and I would honestly love other fantastic listeners like you. Thank you for taking the time to recommend or perhaps even rate the pod. It does mean a lot to me. And I'll see you next time for a conversation where we cut through the noise to find the good stuff that works.